very much. It's always wonderful to be here at the AA. It's a very exciting place to be. It also happens to be, I was just thinking about it as Brett was speaking, that it was the first place where I lecture outside the United States. Very young, my first kind of a sketch of what will become the article on laws and the windows was given here at the AA the last spring of Alvin Boyarsky, and if you look at the AA files that fall, there is Alvin is gone, and then the transcript of the lecture. So I feel like an incredible relationship to this place that in a way showed me kind of my first steps, so to speak. And now that I see Francesca here with the Eileen Gray also that happened here for the first time. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about today, this is a bit of distortion, or is okay with this? Should I put the other microphone, or you hear well? You hear well? Yes, okay, perfect. I'm going to talk about, as Brett already announced, about the glass pavilions between, let's say, Philip Johnson and Mies van der Rohe and SANAA. I'm going to put that in the context of technologies of communication and technologies more recently of surveillance. In fact, this question of the relationship between glass and the technologies of communication has been an ongoing inspiration, so to speak, in my research, a line of in my research, a thread that continuously follow. The history of the modern window for me is a history of communication. The Corbusier horizontal window, for example, I think it's completely unthinkable outside cinema. Not only did Le Corbusier think that film was the most appropriate way to represent modern architecture, but what I'm trying to say is that the frame itself, the way in which we see the wall, if you think about architecture as a machine to see, the frame itself is unthinkable outside the cinematographic frame. Likewise, I have tried to demonstrate more recently that the Eames House is unthinkable outside the colorless light that was introduced precisely during these years and made possible for them making thousands and thousands of colorless lights of their house. And this is, of course, the way in which it is represented by this kaleidoscopic view of colorless lights. So it's no longer the black and white canonic photographs done by a professional photographer. Now it's snapshot that we are continuously doing of our architecture. But also what I'm trying to say is that the vision that the house itself makes possible, if you think about the Eames House, is also unthinkable outside this light. And very quickly, that the picture window at mid-century is unthinkable outside television. That is, in each case, the ambitions of modern architecture to dissolve the line between inside and outside is in fact realized by absorbing the latest technologies of communication. So if communication is basically always about bringing the outside in, for example, when reading a newspaper, to bring in world events into your life, or getting the inside out, for example, by sending a letter. It's actually quite beautiful in this advertisement of mid-century of the 1950s in America of Pella windows, that is precisely a mailman coming with a letter and this kind of interior with these two girls and the two dolls. You can read also in many other different ways, a little bit kind of creepy too. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that if communication is basically about bringing the outside in or the inside out, it will seem as if glass represents this act of communication. And it is almost as if glass takes over more and more of the building as the systems of communication become more and more fluid. Having dissolved the wall into glass, the question has become how to dissolve the glass itself, the last, if you want, delicate line between inside and outside. That is, the relentless quest for greater fluidity between inside and outside is no longer a simple drive towards transparency, but as we will see with SANAA, the glass box has become something else altogether. So to show this transition, then I want to go back to the glass house at mid-century, to the glass house of Philip Johnson, and then move from there to the glass house of today, as represented in the work of Kazuyo Sejima. So let's go back then to Philip Johnson. I mean, of course, the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Philip Johnson is the glass house. But I'm going to introduce another question here, which is methodological. What if instead of relying on his 1950 article where he kind of give us all the laundry list of the influences, that Boulez influenced him, that he copied from Mies, that, you know, like all the sources, or the mountains and mountains of articles that have been accumulated over the years about this house. What if instead of all of this, we take the 20 to 30, listen to this because it's not known at all, television programs that Johnson did in the course of his life? What, then the hypothesis will be, what if the glass house was made for TV? What if Johnson was himself made for TV? And I'm going to pass you a clip of one of these television programs.
My name is Rosamond Bernier. Philip Johnson and I have been friends for many years. As often as we can manage it, we get together and talk about everything from hemlock to hemlines, with time out for forays into art, literature, highly motivated travel, and the best party of the season. We've talked sitting down, in houses, trains, airplanes, but as Philip Johnson's natural tempo is the quick march, we've also talked while walking from one place to another at a steady 4 miles an hour. But no matter where we start, we always end up with architecture. When you start in a design project, what are the very first steps that come through your mind?
Okay, we'll see more. But anyway, two really persistent dreams of the 20th century, that of the all-glass house and that of television, were finally realized around the same time and in exactly the same place, say the suburbs of America. If experiments with glass and glass fantasies have been playing a dominant role in science fiction and also in modern architecture since at least the mid-19th century, only by mid-20th century was the dream finally inhabited in Mies van der Rohe Farnsworth house in Plano, Illinois, and Philip Johnson's glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut. Two spacecraft have landed, so to speak, right? The Farnsworth somehow floating just above the ground like a craft coming into land, and the glass house finally resting on the ground, down on its solid path, anchored in place, and yet somehow a raft, to use Philip Johnson's words. One could even say a flying carpet. What had been experimented in drawings, models, writings, and even pavilions in fairs had become useful. As Luke can put it in another television program, I mean, I think it's still an untapped source, the question of television program. Now you have Luke Hahn on television with Philip Johnson. And he says, some of the most amazing things are say on television because it's a completely different register, like the unconscious of the architect flows there. He goes, the glass house is a marvelous building because it stated very elegantly what was in the secret recesses of everybody's mind at the time of its conception. It brought out the picture of what modern architecture wanted to be. So the house then, in this beautiful description of Kahn, as an image then, as a photograph of what everybody had already in mind, a dream in physical form, the dream of transparency finally inhabited. And here you have pictures of the glass house as represented in Life magazine, precisely inhabited. I mean, it's also very interesting how we don't look so closely. We underestimate the importance of the popular press. I mean, the most beautiful photographs, because of course they have the money, they have the resources, the good photographers, are often in the popular press, and yet you don't even find these sources when you look at a bibliography of the glass house. You have all the architectural magazines and all the architectural books, but never they put Life, Look, and all these, you know, even Vogue and House and Garden, which has amazing material. The glass house then represents the realization, as I said before, of a century, at least a century-old dream of transparent house that it goes back to the science fiction-like quality of a Paul Scherber, for example, in his images of glass buildings in an ideal future in his novels, or on his 1914 collection of aphorisms, Glass Architecture, that was precisely dedicated to Bruno Taut. To Bruno Taut's own glass house, the pavilion for the glass industry in the Bourbon exhibition of Cologne of 1914, here under construction, and here you have Scherber here on the very left, and then finally the building realized. You can think also about the Mies and Lily Rai glass room in Stuttgart of 1927, again inside, or the German pavilion of the Barcelona exhibition of 1929. And here you have Mies with the King of Spain in the inauguration of the pavilion, and again other photographs, also all of them from the popular press in Barcelona in the inauguration of the pavilion. You can think also about the project of Mies of the glass house on the hillside of 1934, again a dream, never possible to realize it yet. You can think about George Keck Crystal House, here photographs with the Buckminster Fuller Diamaxion car parked in the garage. This was built as a pavilion for the Century of Progress International Exhibition in Chicago, and so many other examples of transparency that will come to you. But by 1949, this is the point, the dream of a house defined entirely by glass walls, so we can even say the absence of walls, was fully realized in Mies and Johnson's houses. But also it's important to understand that the absence of traditional walls doesn't really mean that the inhabitants of glass walls, of glass houses are exposed. Because as a Danish reporters say, when visiting American houses right after the war, and he's not even thinking about Johnson or Mies, he's looking at regular American houses with the big picture windows, and says something really beautiful. He says, a glass house bespeaks more security than a stone house because the owner can afford to dispense with the safety of the stone. And here you have pictures of the glass house that you don't see very often, where you can see that actually the house is quite protected by the landscape. Whereas Johnson say of his own house in a 1965 CBS program, this is Philip Johnson, I'm trying to get only the sources that come from television or from the popular press here, as I said before. Well, in this CBS program, this is Philip Johnson, he says, it was an opportunity to live in the woods. He says, and this is a fantastic idea, I think, that a wall is only an idea on your mind. If you have a sense of enclosure, you're already in a room. And to the repeated question of whether his house was a fishbowl that exposed his body to the eyes of others, he answered that in the 16 years he had lived in the house, nobody had come up to glue their faces on the glass. And then he says, I think it is because people are afraid that you are looking at them. So he kind of turns it around, right? It's the people that are afraid to come and look at you, not that you are being exposed. So, of course, he makes evident that the glass wall operates both ways, as artists like Dan Graham had also been exploring since the 1970s. For example, think about this work of the 1970, the alteration to a suburban house, where Dan Graham replaces the facade of a typical suburban house with these glass walls, precisely to expose the reality that in the suburbs the pedestrian is really exposed. The glass house, in any case, operates both ways. But Johnson didn't even experience, and that's even more amazing, the glass as transparent, but he experienced it precisely as wallpaper. And this is a photograph of the wallpaper of the glass house of Philip Johnson. It could also be one of the pavilions of Johnson, but no, it's the glass house. And this one, of course, is the canonic image of the glass house, where you can see really this effect of the wallpaper. In another television program, he says, Philip Johnson says that the glass house works very well for the simple reason that the wallpaper is so handsome. It is perhaps a very expensive wallpaper, but you have a wallpaper that changes every 5 minutes throughout the day and surrounds you with the beautiful nature that sometimes, not this year, Connecticut gives us. The glass then, for Johnson, provides enclosure, containment, rather than openness. He says in another television program, I built this glass house shortly after Mies gave us all the model with his famous glass near Chicago. And this is the model, of course, of Mies, which was already in circulation. Look at this in 1947, now under construction, right? And it's also typical of Johnson, right? Before anybody says you are copying Mies, he says, no, I was copying Mies, of course. And look at this picture, because it's amazing if you think about it in this context that the model appears to be black rather than white, right? And this is an early model of the Johnson house, which is also very nice to see the differences, right? This is wall here, and this is stone wall here. It's a clip. It's actually a still from one television program. I've never seen this model. I can never find any photograph of this stage of the project. Anyway, sorry, I go back to what he was saying. I built this house shortly after Mies gave us the model with his famous glass near Chicago. This one came first, so people think I'm original. I'm not. I knew the plans of the fans worked very well. But of course there are differences. I wanted to live on the ground. I wanted to be contained. I don't believe in outdoor architecture. What you want is a contained house to cuddle you, to hold you near the hearth. You want to get your back up to a fireplace. Any Anglo-Saxon does, but maybe the Italians don't care about it. But we do. So this house is contained, and I must admit that the containment is a rather small feature, a black band that goes all around the house, but it keeps the landscape away. It turns the landscape into a kind of wallpaper, expensive wallpaper to be sure, but wallpaper where the sun and the moon and the stars make different patterns. So it's precisely then this sense of complete envelopment that makes this minimalist statement architecture. If you are in a good piece of architecture, Johnson continues, you have the feeling that you are surrounded. So in fact, rather than dematerialize architecture, the glass in fact reinforces its traditional role. He says architecture is how you enclose a space. That's why I hate photographs, television, and motion pictures. He says precisely during the course of this television interview, he says he hates television, right? Okay, let me just run you the clip where he says other things.
This house I built shortly after Mies van der Rohe gave us all the model in his famous glass house near Chicago. I built this one first so people think I'm original. I'm not. Mies van der Rohe built the first great glass house, and this is sort of a minor copy of it. But of course, there are differences because Mies and I didn't see the same way about living. I wanted to live on the ground. I wanted to be contained. I don't believe in indoor-outdoor architecture, in spite of the looks of this house, that it just as if it was supposed to be connected with the landscape. I'll bother it and down with landscaping. What you want is a contained house to cuddle you, to hold you near the hearth. You want to get you back up to a fireplace. Any Anglo-Saxon does. Maybe the Italians don't care so much about it, but we do. And our original thought is to get up to a hearth and be contained. So this house is contained. I must admit the containment's a rather small little feature of a black band that runs around the house, but it keeps the landscape away. It turns the landscape into a kind of wallpaper. Expensive wallpaper to be sure, but wallpaper where the sun and the moon and the stars make different patterns. How does this house held together? That was Mies's great passion. What does that column do? What happens between those two columns? He once asked me, how was the roof built, Philip? And I said, it's a wooden roof, just the way we always build in America. He says, aren't you ashamed? I hadn't thought it was moral or immoral to build a wooden roof. But you see, to him, that was a treason, that if you build a building like this, of course it has a concrete roof. I don't care what's behind what I can see. That's for the technicians to do. Let them jam straw in there if they want to. It's how this piece of sculpture gets around you, how you walk into it and how you get out of it and how it influences you around behind. It's why I hate photography. It's why I hate television and the motion picture, because they look straight at you like this. You try to pan a camera and see what happens. The space goes around your head until you're dizzy. You can't appreciate space in a movie. It doesn't, it's a frontal.
Okay. Anyway, Television also arrived in the United States precisely at mid-century, and also it has been long part of science fiction fantasies of the future. But television was featured as in its first public demonstration, actually in 1927, prompting Buckminster Fuller. As soon as there is a new technology, there is an architect around the corner saying that he's using that technology, to state that his Dymaxion house of that very same year, 1927, was precisely designed, organized around a television communication center. The Dymaxion house, he claimed, was equipped with the latest media technology: telephone, radio, television, phonograph, dictaphone, loudspeaker, microphone, and so on. But of course, some of those technologies barely existed in 1927. Only in the late 40s and 50s was television widely introduced to the American public, when Dumont and RCA offered their first sets to the public in 1946. And basically between 1948 and 1955, nearly 2/3 of American families bought a television set. In 1950, the most famous of the mass-produced suburbs, Levittown in Long Island, offered a television set built into the walls of its prefabricated Cape Cod houses. This is the initial offering, right? And you have this amazing situation with a couple surrounded by all the, all the elements of the house, and the appliances, the windows, everything is on the floor. And in the center of the plot is exactly the couple with the television set, right? Which, I mean, the beautiful story that Levitt organized, that the appliances, which were still very expensive, particularly the television, will be included in the mortgage, so that there was a very clever stratagem, so that you could, with 25 down, have a television too, right? And all of this. But the amazing thing is that only a year later, the television is not only a discrete appliance, but it's been embedded into the world. So you can say that television has become part of the architecture of the American house. Of course, with all this talk about television, you probably are thinking that nothing could be farther away from the high art wall of a Mies van der Rohe or a Philip Johnson. But yet, the former students of Mies, Edward Duckett and Joseph Fujikawa, say of him, I almost couldn't believe it when I read this. There's a little book where these two students that then have worked with Mies talk about him, and he says, one of them says, Fujikawa, I think, he says, he liked boxing, or at least he enjoyed watching it on television. And the other one, he says, yeah, he had the largest television screen of anybody I knew. I think that Herb Greenwald picked it up for him. So now you have this completely transformative vision of Mies with the biggest television set that anybody had seen. I mean, like a completely kind of changes your view of the heroic man, right? Anyway, who is this Herb Greenwald that bought the television set for him? It's also an interesting story. I did some research into that. It turned out that Greenwald is his character, which was a rabbinical scholar that became a real estate developer, and that associates with Mies in 1946, and between the two of them did fantastic projects. For example, 868, 80 Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago, as you know, twin 25-story glass and steel structures on the shores of Lake Michigan, containing 275 glass apartments each. The project represented, according to one reporter of the time, as I say, I'm only following the popular press. Look at what he says, the reporter of the time. He says that the project represented the fulfillment of Mies' 30 years dream of a skin and bones construction. And then he goes on to say that Mies wanted to give city apartment dwellers the feeling of living close to the outdoors, as people in the suburbs do, who had floor-to-ceiling picture windows in their houses. So he's presenting a fantastic idea, because he could only have said that talking to Mies. But in that reading, then you have that Lakeshore Drive apartments. It's like bringing the suburbs to the city, as if we were stacking up suburban houses, one on top of another. The apartments are glass houses suspended in the air, their walls allowing breathtaking views of the lake from every apartment, but at the same time, turning each apartment into a display. I mean, can you believe what this situation is provoking? Why are there two twin towers facing each other, and nobody seems to be using curtains so that you have these images that also I found in Life magazine, where you can say that the Lakeshore Drive apartments have become like multiplex theaters, providing an audience for each other. It's almost like reality television of our days, but in 1950, each tower looks as its identical twin, as in a mirror images. Inhabitants seem to have been perfectly at ease. As one of the first tenants put it, I feel quite keen and not nearly as exposed as I thought I will feel now that the furniture is in place. And now you have this image again from Life magazine with this guy reading the newspaper and you don't know exactly where you are. Well, the glass house of Philip Johnson, which was built exactly at the same time when most Americans were buying a television set, avoids all media technology. There was not a television set inside in any of the Johnson houses, including the Hudson house of 1951, which was, the client was a television, CBS television executive, so he has to have had not one television set, but many television sets, and yet in all the architectural publications, you will never see a television set. It's like anathema, poof. We'll take it out, right? So here is the house of Johnson, of Hudson, sorry, and he doesn't have a television set. And Johnson himself insisted that the glass house has no television, no telephone, no gramophone, no noise of any kind. So in the end you can say no media in a house that I will argue now was designed precisely for the media. Because the glass house itself, I will argue now, was operating like a television set, but not in the obvious sense of the view that the house makes possible. That is, if one can argue that the post-war, the typical post-war suburban house operated as a television set, like airing, broadcasting family life through the picture window, the Johnson glass house closes itself to the outside much more radically than a stone house will do to become precisely a television broadcasting studio. The model, this model of using your own house as a television broadcasting studio, was picked up later by authorities in the house, on the American house, such as Martha Stewart, who not only uses her own houses as a broadcast studio, but owns also a country estate of all places, also in Connecticut, in Westport, Connecticut, near the Johnson house, with a series of model houses. So in the same way, Johnson had his estate with his series of model structures that built over the years, and he uses each one of them as an opportunity to broadcast. Each time the glass house seems to somehow run out of steam, Johnson builds a new structure, a new building that somehow renews the discussion of himself, but also of the early house. And again, these are images of Martha Stewart when Rem and I went to interview her for Wire magazine. In any case, back to Johnson. He builds a new house every time that he feels like the glass house, a new structure every time that he feels that the glass house is running out of steam. And he says, he calls that getting an itch, he says. I keep building around the place because I get itchy, he says. Nobody asked me to build funny things, so I have to do them for myself as a sort of test. Clients always want something definite with toilets and other necessary gadgets, but I can always build what I like for myself. So about every 5 or 6 years, I build another funny thing, end of the quote. So the glass house was the one first built in 1949. The brick stone house, of course, you can see here with the round windows, and here with the little girl, also in photographs from Life, is also from 1949. The pavilion in the lake was added in 1962. The swimming pool, which, as he says, an important, essential part of the composition, wasn't built until 1963. In 1965, he says, I had some pictures I wanted to hang, so I thought, good opportunity. We will try something funny for a gallery. And since I didn't want to build it too close to the glass house, I put it in a bunker. People think that it's an underground gallery, but it's not underground at all. 1970 was the sculpture gallery. I had nothing to build for a long time. And around 1978, I was itchy again. The land next door came up for sale, so I kept expanding. The studio, he says, was built in 1980. the Lincoln Keystone Tower and the Ghost House in 1985, and the Visitors Pavilion in 1995. So until the very end of his life, he's still building. This is the Keystone Tower, and let me show you another clip.
And he began to think small and build small and have a very good time. Sometimes the constructions that resulted are very small indeed, and sometimes they have a secret purpose, like the tiny pavilion by the pond that was built purely as an architectural exercise to find out how to turn a corner with a column. The latest exercise of that kind is what he calls his Lincoln-Kirstein Tower. Lincoln Kirstein, co-founder and present director of the New York City Ballet, is one of his closest friends, by the way. But when Philip dared me to try it, I wasn't going to say no. But the steps are all on the outside, and it calls for a certain agility. Getting down is even more tricky. But guess who went up and down like a mountain goat with his 80th birthday just round the corner?
Okay, so you see the guy. I mean, he's almost 80, and this is really very high. I mean, I will not go there in a million years, but I mean, she's obviously terrified. You can see that she's terrified. She's going up like nothing is going up this tower. The official story passed in architectural scholarship is that the glass house is Johnson's laboratory, and it is, as Johnson himself put it. I consider my own house not so much a house, although it's that for me, as a clearinghouse of ideas which can filter down later through my own work or that of others. What he doesn't tell us is that the house is a platform for him on the media, precisely, and not only the professional media of the architectural journals, but also the popular media of magazines, not only the architectural, of course, here, Andy Warhol's, Philip Johnson, but in all the architectural journals, but also Vogue, Look, House Beautiful, the Ladies' Home Journal, the New York Times Magazine, Newsweek, Business Week, House and Garden, Show Magazine. You can name it, and Johnson was there. And as I say many times, it's the first time that you see actually color photography, the first time that you have really extraordinary photographers. So it's a really incredible resource that we tend to downplay. But also most surprising, Johnson appeared with astonishing regularity on television programs. From 1951, he's already on television. This is a time which the people on television were not exactly sure of what they were supposed to be doing. But you see always Johnson completely at ease, like he knows what he has to do, you know. The one-liner Johnson is perfect character for television. So he participates in always, what is most interesting is the house always ends up being at the center of all these programs. So all the way, there is also interviews on BBC that perhaps you can see here, one with Susan Sontag, I mean, really amazing material. And each program becomes a new opportunity, as I say, to kind of talk about the house. At the very, very end of his life, he's still in this so old, as you can see here, and again he's talking about the house.
Then the house that some people still believe is the best thing you have ever done.
Oh yeah, a lot of people think the only good thing I've done.
Well, that's true, they do.
That's not mince words around
No,
here.
of course not. Let's get right. How do you characterize this building we're about to see? Roll tape. Let's look at this, or show tape. This is the house that you built for yourself, New Canaan, Connecticut.
Right. So again, you know, the self-deprecating. Yeah, the only thing that some people say is one of the most interesting. No, some people say it's the only thing that I have about. So always self-deprecating strategies, right? So what is this house? And I think the best descriptions are still those of Johnson. He likens this house to a celestial elevator in which when it snows, he says, you seem to be going up because everything else is coming down, which I think is a beautiful idea. It's like the glass house, it's levitating, right? And it reminds me very much of the experience that you have in a train, you know, when you're sitting in a train in a station and all of a sudden you think you are moving, and all of a sudden you realize that you are not moving, that it's the train across the platform that is moving, like the same feeling in the stomach, the same kind of sense of disorientation, except that now the movement is vertical rather than horizontal. And it's at that point precisely where this house of Johnson, which was described by Michael Graves as more Miesian than Mies, precisely departs from that lineage. What is curious about the idea of an elevator is that Johnson also repeatedly notes how much he dislikes elevators, how much elevators represents the end of architecture, the end of the experience of space in movement. For example, of the Seagram building, he says, unfortunately, the entire experience of Seagram leads but to the elevator. That claustrophobic box brings visual, processional beauty to a complete dead end. The visitor can only be restored, if at all, by looking out of a high window. Elevators are here to stay, but one is not forced to love them, end of the quote. So it seems as if then the claustrophobia of the elevator goes away when there is only the elevator in the landscape, the glass house, a free box, a glass elevator in a way with four doors. The glass house has 4 doors. Stay clear then. The containing gesture is now exactly what allows the box to move. And even the black band going around the glass makes sense now. It is like if it's something to hold on when the house goes up. Already in 1947, in his book on Mies, accompanying the exhibition at MoMA, Johnson had described the Farnsworth House as a floating, self-contained cage. Here you have the Farnsworth House. It's still in the construction. It's already completely flooded, right? It's still not finished. And Henry Russell Hitchcock described it as a beach yacht with no provision for outer living beyond the very confined space of the fly screen deck and the small travertine dock below it. So this idea of floating is interesting that you can also find it already in the popular press, like in this article in House and Garden of all sources, right? Which calls the house a glass shelf that floats in the air. So Johnson is happily picking up all these metaphors of the house, of the Farnsworth House, to describe his own house as floating in the sea, even if he dislikes the sea as much as he dislikes elevators. This is what he says. That's why I don't like the seaside. There is nothing there, unless there is a boat. If there is a boat, it's okay. In the East River of Manhattan, of course, wonderful barges go by, but God, keep me from the Atlantic Ocean. There are a lot of glass houses there, and people like them, but face the ocean, and people like them. But I say there is nothing there. So if Mies is a beach yacht, Johnson would rather have his own house at sea. The glass house, says, was designed as a Chinese box. This is another interesting reading of the glass house. This is, of course, the whole property of the glass house that I used this image to kind of illustrate what he says. He says, you have a box, then you take the lid off. This is the Chinese box thing, right? To have a box, then you take the lid off, and there is another one, then another one, and then another one. So what do? We start with a room, but it's rather a large room. It is the landscape from the forest on the road to the forest in the forest, and from the north to the south. So it's this big rectangle where the house is contained. That's the first wall. That's the room. Within that room, we create a raft, again, the raft of a space, the green lawn around you. On the green lawn, we make another raft, which is the house, separate entirely from the green lawn. And on this brown, now he says, brown lawn, as if it were, of the brick floor, we make another lawn, which is this white rack. So the living room, he says, is just this raft of the carpet, right? In the house, in the brown sea, or the brown lawn, let's mix metaphors, of the paving, that again is on a green lawn, which again is on a forest lawn around you. So here, inside, in the carpet, we have the microcosmos, and that outside is the macro, and we have the microcosmos, and outside is the macrocosmos. End of the quote. To experience the house, then, is to move from floating raft to floating raft, each providing a sense of containment. Space is defined precisely by the outer lines of the raft, the lawn, the pavement, the rack. The glass house, then, is not a glass box, but precisely a horizontal surface, a raft. Like this is the concept of space that we are talking about. There are no walls here. But if you imagine in walls, this is the space defined precisely by horizontal surface, by rafts drifting among other rafts and having rafts drifting between it. Now, is this a horizontal movement contradictory to with the idea of the vertical elevator of which Johnson distilled for glass houses by the seaside? Not at all. Johnson, in a way, accumulates metaphors and repeats them in different contexts. The raft lacks direction. It is floating in the sea, not looking at it from an anchor position, as does the modern house. If the raft is an enclosure, in his view, if it provides shelter from the sea, which it does, is precisely, as I was saying before, in the vertical volume defined by the surface of this raft. This is what he says. The intimacy of the raft is so great as the intimacy is as great as the intimacy of a closed room. That's what is hard for all architects to understand who didn't have glass. On the ocean, on a raft, boy, you are enclosed. You can step out. Well, you can step out of this white carpet either, and it brings you emotionally together so you can have a conversation. So, of course, you can see in this night view of the Johnson house, even imagine more this carpet as a raft. And, of course, if it is a raft, it is true that you keep more enclosed, but because if there is a wall, maybe I lean against the wall, right? But if it's a raft and there is no border, I'll be very careful, right? So it's kind of, so this evocative idea of the house as a raft has already been precisely used by Arthur Dressler within a month of the glass house completion in an article in Interiors, where he describes the site of the house as a room with carpets laid out between it, with the herringbone pattern, and within the platform, the sand-colored carpet. He describes all of this as raft. And then he talks about the ocean providing a safe passage. So this raft providing a safe passage for a log couch. Now, is Dressler listening to Johnson or Johnson listening to Dressler? I think something that we have underestimated with Johnson is that he really is like a sponge. He did in a way with the design of the house the same thing that he's doing with his work. He picks up ideas, whether from the popular press or from Arthur Dressler, and recombines them and presents them in a kind of refined and simplified way, like a television personality, a journalist reporting on his own life in an easily understood language. Here there is no difference between the reporter and the thing being reported. Johnson was simply a television program, a reality TV show that ran longer than anybody could have imagined. And here, let me show you the last clip of Johnson.
I would like to be on the wrong side of everything. Architecture, as I've often said, is much too important to leave the architects anyhow. Because architects would go off and do things like this that don't fry any parsnips. Although some architects bridle at being called prostitutes, I don't see why. It's a very old profession, and used to be a very noble one, where you do your best. And we're glad we're wanted.
Because you know what they say occasionally.
What do they say?
You've said sometimes I'm a whore.
Well, that's a very generic remark and takes out of the context all the time. You mean to say you don't work for anybody that you flatter?
No, I don't.
Everybody's a whore comment. It's just a very bad word for a very normal matter. I know I did it to make a colorful contrast, and it did. It's that the Boston paper's blazing, we don't want a whore doing our architecture in Boston, thank you.
We're just as small, just as self-centered, just as egotistical, just as mean as any soprano you've ever known, or any ballet dancer, and there's nothing worse, more difficult than that except a professor of biology.
It's the mother of all the art.
Can you be a great architect without having a huge ego?
Oh, no. The huger the better architect you're apt to be.
Bigger the ego?
Bigger ego, better architect.
Because?
I don't know why. I'm no psychiatrist. Go get a psychiatrist on this show.
Well, we're going to talk about your propagandist quality.
Everybody hates me now because I got along in the profession so much, and I'm building more than any other architect. The mayor, of course, is more interested in so-called cleaning up. He's more interested in cleaning up than we are. I rather enjoy some of the little shops that other people talk so bad about. I'm hoping we can keep some more interesting, to quote-unquote, shops in the neighborhood. Otherwise, it's going to lose its flavor. Like a dog. When he comes into a room, goes around and around, you know, he sniffs his way around. and finally curls with a second curl around, and this room does the same thing.
Who's taking over? The landscape gardeners, the urban planners?
The urban planners, of course, they all nibble away at our profession because we don't have the right words to strike the public right now. We aren't got words like synergistic. I'm not sure what that means, but I see it in the urban planners' manuals. We're not, ecology is all very nice out there, but we've been building buildings before ecology, and I hope after ecology.
So you see the character, no? You see how even an experienced interviewer, right, in PBS, etc.
When you start in a design project, what are the very first steps that come through your mind?
I haven't the slightest idea. I think it's impossible in architecture to say what happens. You see, architecture is not a game that is translatable into the English language. As much as I admire Shakespeare, I just think he was lucky he didn't have to build buildings, because how the deuce would he have translated his sonnets into stone? Now, you see, you remember Richardson's famous phrase, the greatest American architect was not Frank Lloyd Wright, it was Henry Hobson Richardson. And he was so great that they asked him what the first principle of architecture was: get the job.
Get the job, right? So it's all taken from different programs, but it's very hard to get the programs because, you know, television stations, they destroy the tapes of most of those things. So I discovered recently also how important television was for Le Corbusier, and it's been very hard to do the research because you go to BBC, where Le Corbusier was extensively in BBC, and they don't have the tapes. They destroy them. So of all the records, it's the most unbelievably fragile. I tracked down this one with this woman because at that point I thought to myself, Rosemary Bernier, Rosamund Bernier. This one maybe already is alive, and she's 90-something, 97. So she was living in Madison Avenue. So I went and called her, and she was so happy to see me. And I went and have lunch with her, and she was the one who gave me these tapes. When I don't know what program that doesn't exist anymore, and I have them converted, but it's very, very hard to get television program. But you see how amazing it is. Not only you get the character, but you get so many more things about, you know. And how incredible he is on television is really, if I mean, Le Corbusier was the first architect to fully understand the media. When he gets to television, it's no longer his media. I mean, he tries very hard. In the 1950s, Le Corbusier thought that everything now should be on television. And he gets into a lot of television programs in France, in everywhere, and here in the BBC. But he cannot adapt to the medium. I mean, he does all the wrong thing. He turns his camera to the viewer. He writes in the blackboard. He gets very long, elaborate things, and of course they cut him all. He gets mad. He ends up giving up, right? And Johnson, I think, is the first architect to fully understand television, and it becomes a natural. So much so that he's better than the interview. You see him there with Charlie Ross when he asked him about, like, he's asking the big question, right? The question about whether he's a whore or he says he's a whore. And he's very fast, right? You see how he immediately turns around. You mean you don't work for anybody? I mean, he's kind of flustered at that point, Charlie Ross. Like, I mean, so he's faster than the interview, and the response are really very, very interesting. You know what I mean? It's an old profession where we do our best, and we are glad we are wanted, right? Okay, I'm going to move very quickly now to SANAA's glass pavilion in Toledo, in the Toledo Museum of Art, because at first sight it seems, and the project has been extensively read that way, and this is precisely a counter reading to those, as the perfect example of transparency, an all-glass pavilion for all glass object in the glass city, and in this sense, SANAA is seen as an inheritor of the Miesian tradition of radical transparency. In the standard publicity images of the project, you see this project with the white trim pavilion sitting in the park and candidly echoing some of Mies' canonic projects, particularly, of course, the Farnsworth House, which we have already seen, and the 50 by 50 house. Mies, of course, famously deploy sheer glass to radically expose the interior. My interest in this phenomena, which I think you quoted, by the way I see the poster, has been precisely to explore the possibility that transparency in modern architecture was directly related to medical technologies of imaging the body. From that point of view, the logic of the shear glass is exactly that of the X-ray. That is, an inner structure is revealed by a new technology that allows you to look through the outer skin of the body. Mies even described his work as a skin and bones architecture and referred to the structure of the glass skyscraper of 1922 as the skeleton. And if you now look at this render, it's almost, after I have told you that it's almost not impossible not to see them precisely as if you were seeing the building under an X-ray machine. Mies was, of course, deeply interested in X-ray images. He collected them, and he used them in his publications. For example, in the famous publication of G, the magazine that he was editing, he at some point published these images of the X-ray of this head of a woman. But of course, Mies was not at all alone. Books on modern architecture are really filled with images of glowing glass skin revealing inner bones and organs. Think, for example, about Le Corbusier's project for a glass skyscraper of 1925. And again, Le Corbusier, think about Water Gropius, the Bourbon exhibition in Cologne of 1914. Think about the Van Nelle factory in Rotterdam, and at night, even more dramatic. Think about Eric Mendelssohn's Socken department store in Stuttgart of 1926. Think about the Glass Palace in Herlin in the Netherlands by Fritz Perls, here at night. Think about, again, the George Crystal House that we just saw of 1933-34. Think about Buckminster Fuller Diamaxion Tower, and think about all these other images that you have in your head. It's like you start thinking about this way, and the whole history of modern architecture is like an album of X-ray images. These experimental designs from the early decades of the 20th century became the basis of everyday buildings at mid-century, when the see-through glass became, like the transparent house, became really a mass phenomena. And just that happens exactly at the same time that the X-ray, that was also at the beginning an exoteric technology used in sanatorios, become a mass phenomena as well. That is, screening the body for tuberculosis meant precisely penetrating with the gaze areas of the body that were previously invisible. It's exactly the same thing that architecture does, penetrate with the gaze areas that were invisible. The technology of the X-rays, as I say, had been available in sanatorios since the beginning of the century, but only by mid-century did the max X-raying of citizens start on a regular basis. With this development, the now visible interior of the body became not just a tool for diagnosis, but also the site for a new form of public surveillance. Policing the population by scrutinizing their insides, public institutions such as the schools, the military, took over the management of the most private spaces of the body. That is, over a period of half a century, an experimental medical tool has been transformed into a mechanism of surveillance for the entire population. In fact, it's very interesting that this association between X-ray and glasshouse already happened in the popular literature at mid-century. For example, there is this film called Highlights and Shadows, which is a 1937 Kodak Research Laboratory trying to convince people about the virtues of X-ray use in disease prevention. And you have this woman wearing this swimming suit that is strapped to the laboratory table with her body, while her body is subjected to X-ray. Well, as her photographic image above gives way to the X-ray image, the narrator, a male narrator, of course, says, "This young lady, to whom henceforth a glass house will hold no terrors, will, after an examination of her radiograph, be reassured that he is indeed physically fit." So, did you see what I just read? I mean, it doesn't say that this woman, after examining her radiographs, will be reassured that she's physically fit. What is saying in the middle is the astonishing thing with, after an examination of her radiographs, a glass house should hold no terrors. A glass house will no longer be threatening, will not be terror, not even fear, but terror, right? Exactly the same, I think it's a kind of a weird thing of popular culture to associate glass houses with X-rays. Exactly the same set of associations can be seen in the discourse around canonic works of modern architecture. For example, in House Beautiful, Edith Farnsworth, a famous or a successful doctor in Chicago, compare her famous weekend house, designed, of course, by Mies van der Rohe, the Farnsworth house, to an X-ray. And she says in this interview, "I don't keep a garbage can under the sink. Do you know why? Because you can see the whole kitchen from the road on the way here, and the can will spoil the appearance of the whole house. So I hide it in the closet, farther down from the sink." Mies talks about free space, but his spaces are very fixed. "I can even put a clothes hanger in my house without considering how it affects everything from the outside. Any arrangement of furniture becomes a major problem because the house is transparent like an X-ray." So again, she herself, as a doctor, makes the association between the glass house that she owns and the X-ray. The metaphor of the X-ray, of course, was not accidental. Modern architecture, and this is completely under study, cannot be understood outside tuberculosis. It's not by chance that Farnsworth goes on to say of her house, there is already a local rumor that the house is a tuberculosis sanatorium. So the house is an X-ray, and then there is a local rumor that people think that my house is a TB sanatorium. And this is, of course, the bedroom of Farnsworth. The development of the X-rays and of modern architecture actually coincides. Just as the X-ray exposed the inside of the body to the public eye, the modern building also, surprise, surprise, decides to expose its interior. That was previously hidden, previously private, becomes now subject to public scrutiny. A new clarity of vision, a penetrating gaze, liberates a new architecture, an architecture whose structure is meant to be as clear as the gaze looking in. Or so the story goes, because as we have seen with Johnson, and now we'll see also with Mies, actually what really fascinated architects like Johnson and Mies at mid-century is no longer the transparency that has fascinated them in the, or has fascinated Mies in the early decades of the century. But it seems more like they are interested in the way that the gaze gets caught in the layers of reflection. In canonic photographs, the house, the glass house of Johnson itself appears opaque, clad in what Philip Johnson described, and we saw that in the previous clip, as a wallpaper. For Mies and Johnson, reflections actually consolidate the plane of the wall. The complex lines of trees become in Mies, for example, and this is the Barcelona Pavilion, like the veins in marble. When explaining his glass house, Johnson cites Mies' work from 25 years before, and he says, "I discovered by working with actual glass models that the important thing is the play of reflections and not the effect of light and shadow as in an ordinary building." Now, Mies, when he was saying this word, is probably referring to the models of glass skyscraper that Mies have repeatedly photographed in a garden in Berlin before arriving to the canonic images that we know of the glass. But you see all these images that emerged of the archives recently, and that show the glass skyscraper of Mies under a completely different perspective. And he was precisely experimenting with this play of reflection. Charles-André Eames also went to considerable trouble to study the reflections in their house, for example, by placing this model of the original project of the Eames House, the so-called bridge house, on the side and photographing it from every angle. In so doing, they took Mies' experiments one step further. With the Eames House, actually the plane is broken. The reflections of the eucalyptus trees are endlessly multiplied and relocated. As Ray Eames say, after 13 years of living in the house, the structure long ago ceased to exist. I'm not aware of it. So they live in reflections and the reflections of reflections. And again, the Eames House. Now, SANAA, I think, goes one step further in producing this layering of reflections on the inside as well as the outside. That is, the blurring of reflection is no longer at the outside limit of the space. The whole space, you can say, is at the limit, as you can see in this image of Novartis. There is no clear cut inside or outside. The space is neither in nor out, and seems to extend to infinity, as you can see, for example, in these images of Kanazawa Museum. In such a space, walls are not optical barriers, but optical intensifiers. The walls, in fact, are exposed along with the people and the objects. That is, for example, in the Toledo Museum, it's very clear that the limits of the walls are exposed, the inner and the outer edge that you can see in this image, and of course you can see now in the plan what I'm talking about, and you know this project very well, but just in case. But most importantly, what they are showing is also the gap between the inaccessible space of the wall itself, where you cannot enter that space, is a really important is part of the experience of the space. The double line of the wall marks then somehow undoes any sense of solidity here. SANAA vision is far from crystal clear. In fact, the glass pavilion in Toledo seems to be more about a kind of a blurring of the view, a softening of the focus, than about the transparency of the early European avant-garde. In SANAA's work, no structure is ever revealed. The buildings are not even structures you look into or out from. They are optical devices without visible mechanism. The real view is actually not from the outside looking in or the inside looking out, as in Mies or Johnson, but the inside looking even further inwards, not to discover the inner secrets of the building, but in a way to be suspended in the view itself. In Toledo, the visitor is literally suspended between these carving walls. What you see through the glass layer in front of you is yet another layer and then another one. Even the objects displayed, as you know, through all these layers are made themselves of glass. That's what the museum is. It contains objects of glass. Looking through the layers, the vision is softened and distorted, with the curves even accentuating the distortion. So if SANAA is the inheritor, as most critics want, of the Miesian transparency, the latest, let's say, in a long line of experiments, she, in a way, is the ultimate Miesian, leaping beyond transparency into a whole kind of mirage effect. For example, here in this drawing or rendering of Novartis. So after centuries of architecture organized by the straight lines of the viewing eye, we now have an architecture formed by the kind of soft distortions of the gaze, a more kind of, you want, tactile experience of vision. To enter a SANAA project is in a way to be caressed by a subtle softening of the territory. Even the reflections of the trees in the outer layer of the glass has a softness that you can never find in Mies, whether it's in the rendering or in the full-size model that you can have here. They always do these one-to-one models, because with such, of course, tactile sense of visions, models are crucial in their practice. In the working of the studio, countless models are made of every possible solution in order that the effect can be felt before it's fixed in drawing. Indeed, SANAA goes for the variation whose effects are more unclear. She says, and this I think is amazing, he says, we try not to select options for which we can already imagine the outcome. So this is an architecture really of deliberately unclear vision. The modern discourse of X-rays cutting through the outer layers to reveal secrets gives way here to inner layers endlessly folded and overlapping fabrics that intensify the mystery rather than remove it. The X-ray logic absorbed by modern architecture culminates in a dense cloud of ghostly shapes. The clearness of glass is now used precisely to undermine clarity. So in conclusion, the architecture of SANAA, despite what most critics have been saying, I don't think at all it's an architecture of transparent vision, but it's more a kind of a blur vision, a veil vision, more nebulous, more like more oceanic, you could say too, more like I don't know, like a dense snowstorm or I don't know, or dense fog. Today, there are new forms of surveillance technologies operating in the city, and there are also these new models of vision that I think act as a new paradigm for the window today. We can, of course, not predict which of these technologies will be absorbed into architecture, but some already are impacting the built environment. I'm talking, of course, about handheld scanning devices that are capable of seeing through clothing, through walls, through buildings, and are used by the military, but also increasingly by the police. And they are effectively making solid walls behave like glass. and open up the possibility or even the inevitability of new kinds of architectural experiment. Here you have, for example, forward-looking infrared radar or FLIR, for example, which is one of these technologies. It is based on the electromagnetic frequencies at which heat radiates from organisms and structures. So seemingly solid walls no longer offer privacy. In fact, this FLIR scan reveals activity that has already finished, so you can be exposed even if you're no longer in the building, you're already left, but the kind of the heat signature remains for a while, so the lay is in a way incorporated into a new kind of vision. Bodies, again, are treated in the same way as buildings with the passive millimeter imaging, PMI, which is, again, is used in US customs to detect hidden weapons or contraband in clothing, but also in bags, in vehicles. So it's like stripping really the outer layer of the body. And the images themselves, I suppose one could spend some time analyzing them, but I suppose you see the same thing I do, so I leave it for you. And with the Kaya lens, anyone can use a regular camera, even a cell phone camera, to see through clothing by concentrating in the infrared spectrum. These technologies are, of course, very controversial. The use of PMI has been restricted due to privacy concerns, and the Kaya lens is illegal in the United States and also in Europe, although I think people get it through the internet anyway. So the mid-century fear of the loss of privacy in the glass house and with the X-ray has reappeared. It is as if each new technology that exposes something private is originally or initially perceived as threatening and then quickly absorbed into everyday life. So the fear of the glass house seems to us almost quaint today. You know, this fear that this woman had of both having an X-ray, of people had of having an X-ray and of living in glass houses. Even the grainy kind of black and white images of video surveillance seems already less invasive now than a few years ago, almost reassuring. Perhaps today's scanning technologies will also seem quaint in the future, since each technology goes deeper and deeper into the private. The definition of private changes with its new invasion. Meanwhile, the original glass house seems to have re-emerged as a mobile turned into a protective bunker, with the Pop Mobile designed with these 4 sides of bulletproof glass after the 1981 assassination attempt. It's like almost a Johnson glass on wheels, right? It's amazing because now this transparency is precisely used as a bunker. It's a form of protection rather than exposure. Soldiers in Iraq also have appropriated the concept with what they call precisely pop glass, which is made of this ballistic-proof windshield that are welded to the top of their Humvees to offer protection against snipers. They are doing it themselves. So, in conclusion, the point of these quick notes about SANAA and new surveillance technologies is that in changing our definition of public and private, the new surveillance technologies, like the technologies that emerged in the early years of the last century, changed our understanding of architecture. Architecture is never threatened by new technologies, as we have seen repeatedly through this lecture. On the contrary, architecture feeds on those technologies. Our field, I think, is currently digesting these new models of vision, and I think it's possible that new architectures will emerge inevitably of this new, out of these new technologies. Thank you very much. Sure.
Will this one work to do questions? Yeah. Thank you so much for the talk. I've had the chance to see many of your lectures over the years, and seeing this latest work again, I had a chance to see it last year when we were in Spain. I'm struck by the assimilation of the videos within the presentation, and in a way, the topic that you're working on is evolving the historical research in ways that you're not commenting on directly, but are obviously having an impact on the presentation itself and the way you form the argument. The video material is now being incorporated as if it's text, but also being used in ways that are quite different than a traditional textual approach to histories. And I'm just wondering if you might comment upon the way you and your students within the program right now are sort of discussing or reflecting upon the implications from the historical methodological side? Because it's quite striking, the evolution from the books that I cited in the introduction, even as recently as 92, 94, with the ability now to embed these kind of media within the presentation, and having moved beyond the still imagery, that it's clearly challenging the question of the archive, and Tafuri's sense of the relationship of the historian to the archive, that you're now exploding in a way, well beyond the boundaries of the universities and places, the foundations where you're doing the research. But are there other kind of methodological issues that have come up that you all are discussing, and how you actually work on the material?
Right. No, I think it's a very good point. I don't think I have reflected on it consciously. I mean, I think I learned from Tafuri, by the way, will be completely horrified. I mean, can you imagine looking at all? First of all, he never look at anything having to do with popular press, and I'm precisely arguing that the popular press is an extraordinary resource for us. In architecture to understand, and it has been so neglected that it's almost unbelievable, no? Even by the Fondation Le Corbusier, you know, when doing the work on recently for the last exhibition, which I think is coming here to the Barbican, the exhibition of the Vitra, Bon Moss asked me to write about Le Corbusier and the media, and I said, the media and Le Corbusier, didn't I, you know, I mean, like again. But then, you know, I went to the archives and I started asking them, you know, I would like to do something about television, because what if Le Corbusier was, must have done something on television? Oh, no, there is nothing. Well, there is the funeral, you know, so I watched the funeral, which in itself is amazing, right? But no, he was not. And then, you know, I say, okay, so they don't have anything at all of Le Corbusier on television. Looking through the correspondence, which is like a detective work, I start seeing these letters from television, you know, from the BBC, and then he gets paid, so this has happened, right? And letters about how wonderful he was, or you know, and arrangements about meeting here. So this is how it was done, like pulling teeth. And the same thing with Johnson. You go to the Museum of Modern Art, they have one tape. They don't have any of these tapes. So this is one thing. How difficult, in fact, it is to do the research into the popular press, because the work has not been done for you. There's extensive bibliographies of Johnson, but you will not find the looks and the lives and all these popular magazines, and the books and the House and Gardens and all these things, and you will not find any of the television programs. So in terms of methodological research of this new, but we are talking is something else. How the new technologies has allowed me to, you know, in a way, I think that each subject kind of infects you with a different bag. So from Le Corbusier, I learned to pay a lot of attention to publicity and to images and so. By the time I got to the Eames, I understood from them this kind of, you know, the way in which they use multiple screens, they surround you with images, the capacity to see much more than you thought. And I find myself doing the same thing, trying to incorporate that form of vision into my own work on them, not consciously but unconsciously. So there were many more images and many more screens and more things happening. Of course, the new technologies allow them, allow that possibility, right? Introducing the films into the PowerPoints, etc. But I haven't thought about it from, I mean, seriously with my students, as you say, bring it as a question. I guess I have absorbed them in the way that the students themselves absorb them. I learn from them, of course, you know, how to do.
That seems to be one of the things you're presenting, is that the architects are clearly reflecting upon it and being sometimes quite strategic. I mean, to the point that they become, with the Eames example that you've done work on, producers of this material.
Right.
And it seems as though that's an interesting relationship then between the architects and the historians, who then, like you, go back and look at them, that there is a kind of delay in that, which is interesting.
Right.
Not just as a topic, but as a way of working within the
It's
discipline.
also a production, because of course you are speaking in the present and you are speaking in this is very important. I think that's something that Gideon say as a historian, that you are always speaking in the present. So our view on the Eames is always, of course, or my view on the Eames is affected by the new realities of communication. It's impossible to think about the Eames without thinking about the web, thinking about what the computers have made possible for us.
Questions? Then we'll stop there. Beatriz, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.